The temptation when we think about things like this is to consider that what we're trying to do is to find a creative way to present the gospel so that then people can become Christians and join churches and become Christians in the same way that we are. But you don't have to think about it very long before you start to realise that what we need is a wholesale reimagining and new presentation of the gospel, root and branch in a specific culture. A very, very simple example is the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, Luke's Gospel too, books of Chronicles, where you have long series of genealogies, the begats. Most British Christians, if we're honest, skip over those. We don't remember the names, and we don't take a deep interest in it. Because ancestors, heritage, are not really something that we see as being deeply important. But in many parts of the world, your ancestry, where you spring from, is incredibly important to your identity, to who you are. And to show that Jesus Christ was a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of David, ultimately a descendant of Adam, places him in a historical context, in a family context, which makes him more real. To skip over the genealogies in those contexts would be to miss something very important. And then to show, as Paul does, that we are adopted as heirs with Christ, places us in a family context. In situations like that, the whole issue of the family of Jesus and our adoption takes on a whole new meaning. And so what we see is the development of African theologies, as African Christians get to grips with how the Bible message speaks in their context, not automatically assuming that what we see as being important is important there. There is no bland, vanilla Christianity. As the gospel, as the scriptures come into each context, they speak different things into the cultures. The scriptures change culture, but the scriptural message and the expression of the gospel is also adapted to the culture. The way we see this most simply is in worship. Not everyone stands in pews, or sits in pews and stands to sing, sits to pray, or kneels to pray. Different Christian groups around the world adapt the way they worship to fit the context they come from. You know, one of the saddest things that I've seen is a lot of traditional mission slideshows or videos. You know, they start off with the brave young couple going off into the distance to preach the gospel to the group, and they're successful, people become Christians. And then just before the video ends with the traditional sunset, the last shot is of a group of new believers who are singing What a Friend We Have in Jesus, or some other familiar song to us, but in their local language. And it's exciting because they're using the local language, but the sad thing is that so often this has been done still using Western music and Western songs. As the gospel really becomes rooted in a culture, people will start to use their own music, their own styles, their own art to reflect the truth of the gospel. It isn't about taking the history of Western Christendom, the way that we do things, into other parts of the world. Contextualization is about authentic Christianity, meeting the needs and being expressed in the ways that people do things naturally. The book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 7, has this wonderful picture of people from every tribe, tongue and nation gathered round the throne of the Lamb and worshipping him. And just think about that for a moment. You've got people from everywhere in the world with all of their musical traditions. You know, there's a Welsh male voice choir, there's Gregorian plain song, there's Japanese music, African music, all of those different styles all mixing in, and each one brings something new. The contextualized gospel shows us different aspects of the nature of God. As each language, as each culture brings something into the mix, the choir that we're going to have on those last days is going to be absolutely incredible. And it will express something that no one language, that no one culture could do. There is a richness, there is an insight into the character of God that we will gain through authentic, contextualized Christianity as we all come together, that none of us could ever do on our own. But there's one further challenge. If we have to look at how should the gospel be presented and expressed and lived in each culture, we have to look back at ourselves and say, are we getting it right? One of the challenges that missionaries face is, as communities become mature and develop, they will turn around and challenge the missionaries and say, the scriptures say this, but you're doing that. And it's necessary for us in the West, in Britain, to start to rethink what exactly does it mean to be a Christian in our culture at this point in history. We've lived through huge changes, and many of them we've just accepted and taken on board. And we have to ask ourselves, how does the gospel impact this? I mentioned earlier about Cameron Townsend and Donald McGravin taking Western science in terms of linguistics, in terms of social science, and using them as tools for the gospel. We have an automatic assumption that if we have the technology, that we should use it. The technology provides the solutions to our questions. What does the gospel have to say to that? Is that correct? I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but I think we need to start asking deeper questions about how the gospel should affect the way that we live, the way that we do things, our basic understandings. As our society has changed, we need a contextualized, authentic gospel that speaks into British life in 2009. And we need to know the ways that we can present the gospel to people around us in a way that's as effective as talking about a peace child was to the Sawi all those years ago.